Look, I'm here to talk about the authoritarians' tool of choice in using cyberspace to achieve political aims, cyber-enabled economic warfare. Where I work at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, we work to support beleaguered democracies that face off against authoritarians. So we spend a lot of time in Ukraine, in Israel, South Korea, and most recently, Taiwan. We've studied cyber-enabled economic warfare for over a decade, and we have found it was preferentially the tool of choice. And certainly following Russia's, unprovoked, vicious attack of Ukraine as a large-scale maneuver warfare, one of the number one takeaways must have been, let's look at cyber-enabled economic warfare as a more desirable, less risky alternative. So in thinking about that, I want to define for you cyber-enabled economic warfare. It's the coordination of cyber attacks with other gray zone activity, particularly information operations, to target a society's key centers of gravity, whether it's economic, critical infrastructure, their energy systems and water systems, or just public trust in the government. It's a synthesis of several lines of effort, and it really goes at, I think, three vectors for intrusion and disruption: the financial systems, energy systems, and communication systems. And it uses not just cyber and information operations, but diplomatic tools, economic tools, and in China's case particularly, lawfare tools. As I said, it's become their preferred tool in China. And I'll show you here. I spent 10 years as a carrier strike group commander in Asia, commanding our frontline units, and then as the head of operations for Indo-Pacific Command. And all I thought about was something called the most dangerous scenario, which is a cross-state invasion or a heavy blockade. And it's certainly important for the U.S. Department of Defense to think about that. But the reality is that's not how China thinks now. China has to have observed the fighting in Ukraine and realized that the best way to win a war like this is, the best way to win this war is to win without fighting and without risking U.S. intervention and without causing the massive destruction of Taiwan's main assets in a costly conventional conflict. You can only imagine, if you've seen what ballistic missiles and cruise missiles have done in Ukraine, what that same kind of damage would do in Taiwan to what is a world-class microelectronics and semiconductor manufacturing industry. So in my mind, we've already seen the Chinese Communist Party implementing these efforts in and around Taiwan. And what they do is they wisely do it in conjunction with military maneuvers, so they get the value of the naval exercise or the air exercise, while at the same time imposing pressure with cyber and information operations. And as I said, I think China really looks at, Taiwan has, every critical infrastructure every other country would have, but the three areas that the CCP really fixates on are financial services, telecommunications, and energy, because these are the ways to break a country's societal resilience as fast as possible. And I think China thinks they could probably do this, increase that pressure slowly in a way that the U.S. and its allies and partners, and no country will act before the United States in defending Taiwan. So you can bring up those cyber attacks, bring up the information operations attacks in a way that the United States doesn't cross what we'd call a red line, and the U.S. won't respond. And certainly the rest of the international community is fairly cowed by Chinese threats, so no one else would respond. And look, I also think at the same time, China is likely to include cyber attacks on the U.S. and Japan. And these would be attacks taking advantage of the operational preparation of the battlefield that they already did against the United States. This is known as Volt Typhoon. It's an advanced persistent threat team that has either placed malicious software, malware, or just gained access and identified accesses to thousands of U.S. pieces of critical infrastructure. And that critical infrastructure is highly targeted at rail, aviation, and port systems, the systems the U.S. would use to do military mobility to a Taiwan event. So a big part of cyber-enabled economic warfare won't just be an attack on Taiwan, but an attack on those allies and the critical infrastructure of the allies and partners in the US and Japan that would come to their support. And you can imagine that if China can do this in Taiwan, Russia can do Taiwan can do this in a Taiwan scenario against the United States and Japan. Russia can do this in a European scenario against Europe and the United States as well. So to me, that branch effort of operational preparation of the battlefield against the people who might support an ally would be very detrimental. Now look, just real quick so you understand why this is so likely to happen and what the impact would be on all of us globally. I got to give you a quick 1 minute on Taiwan's energy challenge. Taiwan imports, it's an island and it imports 98% of its energy. It is one of the world's most energy insecure economies. And 50% of their power is liquefied natural gas plants, LNG plants. And they only have about 10 days of stowage of LNG. And that LNG comes in 1 ship a day, 350 ships a year. Why is that important? All of Taiwan's LNG terminals are on the coast facing China through the Taiwan Straits. And China can easily conduct a quarantine or a embargo that slows down the flow of LNG ships to Taiwan. And when you combine that with cyber attacks on the grid, Taiwan's energy grid is further at risk because it is the most loaded grid in the OECD of the major developed economies. It is a grid that runs at the highest level of demand. 75% of the grid is needed every day on a normal day. So you have this combination of a highly risky supply, liquefied natural gas, to an at-risk grid operating already at 75%, and a voracious adversary that can easily attack it. To me, this becomes a problem very quickly. Now, here's the challenge. Let's say China takes down, blocks LNG from getting to Taiwan, and their grid drops down to 50%. Taiwan's leadership, like any national leadership, would have to choose between, do I provide power to homes and hospitals and schools, or do I provide power to TSMC and UMC and the other critical elements of the semiconductor manufacturing supply chain, the plurality of legacy chips and the supermajority of all high-end chips that are delivered to the world? If I were President Lai Ching-te of Taiwan, I would cut off the international supply of semiconductor chips, because I would want to make this crisis for him a catastrophic economic problem for the world, so he got some support. So you can quickly see this kind of cyber-enabled economic warfare campaign quickly becoming an economic maelstrom or a catastrophe for the world. So, we run these tabletop exercises all over the world, in Taiwan and Japan, and a lot in the United States for our Congress and in Europe. And as I said, we consistently find that the Chinese Communist Party successfully cuts off liquefied natural gas. The U.S. response is almost always weak, and our other allies do even less. So inevitably, this kind of campaign will be successful unless some recommendations are followed. And you don't need to see all of these. I'll just say in the cyber domain, the 3 that struck me the most are, like everywhere else in the world, almost all developed countries, there is insufficient public-private collaboration and protecting the critical infrastructure. Taiwan probably has to develop an offensive cyber capability similar to what the United States and Israel and a few other countries acknowledge having. And then other countries, like the United States, need to organize a cyber collective ahead of time, like we did for Ukraine, to support them in the development of a more resilient cyber defense. So really what it comes down to, there really is one big takeaway. You need proactive preparation to counter cyber-enabled economic warfare. In Taiwan, they need to invest in that societal resilience I talked about. And fortunately, President Lai Ching-te is doing a lot of that. Unfortunately, this is probably 5 to 7 years after China started its hard work, so Taiwan is lagging. They're going to have to improve that public and private critical infrastructure I mentioned. And they need to have a reliable ally. And, I don't know if you've read the most recent U.S. national security strategy that President Trump put out last week, but in 33 pages, he never managed to mention once China and cyber. He never mentioned Volt Typhoon. So we have a massive ongoing cyber attack on the United States, and the president is unwilling to acknowledge it in a 33-page national security strategy for fear of offending China. And most of us understand that that was in the original drafts of national security strategy and was actually removed by cabinet secretaries who are more interested in cooperating with China and trading with China than they are in confronting China's adversarial behavior. But in any case, the United States has got to signal it has resolve to do something about Taiwan, because if it doesn't, this attack's going to start soon. China will just slowly increase the settings of the cyber-enabled economic warfare to keep it just below any U.S. red line, but above the boiling point for Taiwan's national critical infrastructure. So look, public planning and exercising is critical. And if I were to kind of wrap this up, I would say the longer, and I'm going to back it out of Northeast Asia and Taiwan, I'd say the longer Russia fails in Ukraine, the key takeaway for any authoritarian state is that kinetic warfare stuff doesn't work. You got to go against, when you do kinetic warfare, you line up people against you. You get Europe and previously the United States to really support Ukraine. It's easier to keep this fight in the gray zone. And look, so first of all, now you have this example that it's better to stay in the gray zone. The second big driver is the tools for cyber and economic warfare in the gray zone are getting much better. Cyber malicious tools, information operations tools to undermine societal support are getting better. So democracies have to prepare. They have to prepare early and often. And a final point I would say is this leads to one takeaway. Prior planning prevents, as we say in America, piss poor performance. That means if you prepare ahead of time, you have a chance in this warfare. If you continue to not prepare, you're going to be in a lot of danger. So Franco, that's what I had. Thank you very much for the chance.